The evening shift had been surprisingly quiet for Officer Mitchell, the kind of quiet that usually made experienced cops a little nervous. As he cruised through the dimly lit streets of his patrol area, the radio crackled to life, breaking the peaceful hum of his police cruiser. Dispatch to Unit 247, we have a report of a trespassing incident at Riverside Shopping Center. Security reports an elderly male refusing to leave the premises. No signs of aggression, but they're requesting assistance. Mitchell reached for his radio, Unit 247 responding. ETA 5 minutes. He let out a small sigh as he flipped on his turn signal. After 15 years on the force, he'd handled countless similar calls. They usually involve teenagers causing trouble or sometimes homeless individuals seeking shelter. Either way, they rarely took more than 20 minutes to resolve. The shopping center came into view as he turned onto Main Street. Most of the stores had closed hours ago, their windows dark except for the security lights that cast long shadows across the empty parking lot. The place looked almost ghostly at this hour, with only the buzz of fluorescent lights from the corner drugstore breaking the darkness. As Mitchell pulled into the lot, his headlights swept across a lone figure sitting on a bench outside what used to be an old bookstore. The security guard, a young man probably in his mid-20s, was standing about 20 feet away, anxiously shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Mitchell could tell from the guard's body language that he was new to the job and uncomfortable with the situation. "Thanks for coming, officer," the guard said, walking over as Mitchell stepped out of his cruiser. "He's been here for almost 3 hours now. Won't budge, barely even looks at me when I talk to him." The guard's voice carried a mix of frustration and concern. "I tried being nice about it, you know. But my supervisor's breathing down my neck about liability issues." Mitchell nodded understandingly as he observed the elderly man from a distance. The streetlights revealed more details now: a military jacket that had seen better days, shoulders slightly hunched forward, and gray hair that needed a trim. But what caught Mitchell's attention was how the man sat perfectly still, almost like a statue, except for his hands, which seemed to be holding something he kept staring at. "Has he said anything at all?" Mitchell asked, keeping his voice low. "Just mumbles mostly," the guard replied. "Something about needing to wait for someone. I tried explaining that the center's closed, but it's like he doesn't even hear me." The temperature had dropped considerably since sunset, and Mitchell could see his breath in the cold air. The elderly man wasn't dressed for this weather, just the old jacket and what looked like a thin pair of pants. No gloves, no hat, nothing to keep warm. As Mitchell approached, his boots made soft sounds against the concrete, but the man didn't look up. Getting closer, he noticed more details that made his cop instincts kick in, but not in the way he expected. The military jacket wasn't just any old army surplus, it was authentic Vietnam-era gear, complete with unit patches that had faded but were still recognizable. The man's hands, though trembling slightly from the cold, had the weathered look of someone who'd worked hard his whole life. "Good evening, sir," Mitchell said, using his gentlest tone, the one he usually reserved for talking to his own father. "I'm Officer Mitchell. Mind if we chat for a minute?" For the first time, the man's eyes flickered up from whatever he was holding. Mitchell caught a glimpse of what appeared to be an old photograph, its edges worn smooth from years of handling. But it was the man's eyes that made Mitchell pause. They weren't angry or confused, as he often saw in these situations. Instead, they held a depth of sadness that seemed to reach across the space between them. The light from the street lamp caught the man's face, revealing features carved by time and experience. His eyes were clear but red-rimmed, suggesting he'd been crying recently. A small American flag pin, tarnished but carefully maintained, was attached to his jacket's collar. "Sir," Mitchell tried again, "it's getting pretty cold out here. The shopping center's closed for the night." He took a careful step closer, noting how the man's grip tightened slightly on the photograph. "Maybe I can help you get somewhere warmer." The security guard shifted impatiently behind them, probably hoping for a quick resolution so he could get back to his routine. But something about this situation felt different to Mitchell. His training had taught him to take control of situations quickly, to establish authority and maintain order. But 15 years of experience had also taught him when to trust his gut, when to slow things down. He noticed a small tear running down the elderly man's cheek. catching the artificial light before dropping onto the photograph he held. The man's lips moved slightly, forming words too quiet to hear, like he was having a conversation only he could hear. Mitchell's hand moved away from his utility belt, where it had instinctively rested. Instead, he began unbuttoning his winter jacket. The night had gotten cold enough that he could feel the chill through his uniform, but something told him this moment called for a different kind of police work. The security guard watched in confusion as Officer Mitchell, instead of preparing for an arrest, carefully removed his jacket. The next few minutes would prove that sometimes the most powerful moments in law enforcement have nothing to do with enforcing the law at all. As Officer Mitchell draped his warm police jacket over the elderly veteran's shoulders, the security guard stepped forward, clearing his throat nervously. "Officer, my supervisor's on the phone. He wants to know if we're going to have to call for backup." The young guard's voice cracked slightly, revealing his discomfort with the situation. Mitchell held up a hand, signaling for patience. He'd noticed something in the veteran's eyes. A distant look that he'd seen before, though usually in much younger faces. It was the same look his uncle wore during family gatherings when the conversation drifted too close to his time overseas. Some called it the 1,000-yard stare, but Mitchell knew it was more than that. It was the look of someone seeing two worlds at once, the present and a past that wouldn't let go. The photograph in the veteran's trembling hands caught the fluorescent light from the nearby drugstore. Mitchell could make out the edges of what looked like an old military photo, its corners soft and worn from years of handling. Every few seconds, the man's thumb would brush across the image in an almost unconscious gesture, like someone checking to make sure their wallet was still in their pocket. "Been sitting here a while, haven't you?" Mitchell asked softly, maintaining a respectful distance. He'd learned over the years that sometimes the best way to help someone was to give them space to feel heard. The cold night air carried the faint sound of traffic from the nearby highway, a reminder of the world continuing its normal pace around them. The veteran's voice, when it finally came, was rough with emotion. "They said they'd meet me here." His words were quiet but clear, each one carrying the weight of decades. "We always met here, every year, same bench, right outside the old bookstore." His eyes flickered to the empty storefront, its windows now covered with for lease signs. Mitchell noticed how the man's shoulders hunched forward, as if carrying an invisible weight. The military jacket he wore, despite its age, had been carefully maintained. The patches, though faded, had been restitched in places. This wasn't just an old piece of clothing, it was a connection to something important. The security guard's radio crackled, making the veteran flinch slightly. Mitchell caught the young guard's eye and gestured for him to step back, which he did, though reluctantly. The guard didn't understand what was happening here, but Mitchell did. Sometimes a police officer's most important tool wasn't his badge or his authority, but his ability to recognize when someone was fighting battles that couldn't be seen. "Sir," Mitchell said, settling onto the far end of the bench, "that photo in your hands. Would you mind telling me about it?" He kept his voice casual, like two strangers sharing a moment on a park bench rather than an officer responding to a call. The veteran's hands tightened around the photograph for a moment before slowly extending it toward Mitchell. The paper was soft with age, its colors faded to sepia tones, but the image was still clear. 5 young men standing in front of a military helicopter, arms around each other's shoulders, faces split with wide grins that seemed to deny the reality of where they were. "Third from the left," the veteran said, his voice stronger now. "That's me. 48 years ago today." His finger trembled as it pointed to a young soldier who stood tall and proud, wearing the same jacket he had on now. "The others, they were my boys. My responsibility." His voice caught on the last word. Mitchell leaned in slightly, studying the photo with genuine interest. He could see the family resemblance between the young soldier in the photo and the man sitting beside him now, same determined, set to the jaw, same steady gaze. Time had changed the outside, but something in those eyes remained unchanged. The veteran continued, words beginning to flow more freely now. "We made a pact, you see. Whoever made it home would meet here, every year on this date. This bench, it used to be right outside that bookstore. Mrs. Chen, she owned it back then. She'd leave the lights on for us, even after closing. Said her father was a soldier too, she understood. Mitchell noticed how the man's hand kept returning to the left breast pocket of his jacket, where a small bulge suggested he carried something else besides the photo. The gesture seemed unconscious, like a rosary bead touched for comfort. "Last year, there were still two of us," the veteran said, his voice dropping to barely more than a whisper. "Now it's just me. First time in 48 years I'm sitting here alone." A tear rolled down his weathered cheek, but he made no move to wipe it away. Could not come, though. Made a promise, you see, and they'd be here if they could. The security guard had retreated to the far end of the building, apparently sensing that this wasn't a typical trespassing case. His radio occasionally crackled with updates from his supervisor, but he'd stopped responding, caught up in watching the scene unfold. Mitchell felt something in his chest tighten. He'd started his shift expecting to handle a routine call, maybe issue a warning, or make an arrest if necessary. Instead, he found himself sitting next to a piece of living history, a man keeping a decades-old promise to brothers who never made it home. The night had grown colder, but neither man moved from the bench. Sometimes, Mitchell knew, the most important part of being a police officer was knowing when to set aside the rulebook and simply be present for another human being's moment of need. The true story was just beginning to unfold, and it would change both their lives in ways neither could yet imagine. The night grew quieter as Officer Mitchell studied the patches on the veteran's jacket more closely. The insignia of the 101st Airborne Division stood out clearly against the worn fabric, the famous Screaming Eagle that had become legendary during the Vietnam War. His fingers instinctively reached for the small photo he kept in his own wallet, one that showed his father wearing the exact same patch. "My father served in the 101st, Mitchell said softly, surprising himself. He rarely shared personal details while on duty, but something about this moment felt different. He never talked much about it, but he kept his jacket hanging in our hallway my whole life. Same eagle, same colors." The veteran's eyes shifted from the distant point he'd been staring at, focusing on Mitchell's face with newfound interest. "Which company?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of the commanding officer he must have once been. "Charlie Company, 69 to 70, Mitchell replied, watching as recognition flickered across the older man's features. For the first time that night, the veteran's posture straightened slightly, as if the mention of the unit had awakened something in him. "We might have crossed paths, your father and I," the veteran said, his weathered hands smoothing the photograph in his lap. The jungle had a way of bringing units together, especially during the monsoon season. He paused, looking down at the young faces in the photo. "These boys here, we were dog company. Started out with 37 men in our platoon." Mitchell noticed how the veteran's thumb kept returning to one particular face in the photograph, a young soldier with a wide grin and a guitar case propped against his leg. The image had been handled so often that it was slightly faded in that spot, as if the veteran had been trying to reach through time itself to touch his friend. "That's Bobby," the veteran said, noticing Mitchell's gaze. "Could play any song you'd name, just by ear. Used to say music was the only thing that made sense in that place." His voice softened. "He was writing a song the morning before, well, before everything changed." The security guard had long since retreated to his office, seemingly understanding that this was no ordinary trespassing call. The only sounds now were the distant hum of late-night traffic and the gentle rustle of leaves in the cold breeze. Mitchell pulled out his wallet, carefully extracting the old photograph of his father. The edges were crisp, protected by plastic, showing a young man in uniform standing beside a helicopter. "Dad never showed me many photos from back then," he said, holding it out. "Just this one." Said some memories were better left in the past. The veteran handled the photograph with the gentle reverence of someone who understood its true value. "Your father was right about that," he said, studying the image. "But some memories need to be kept alive. That's why we made our pact on this bench. To remember. To make sure somebody remembered." His hands returned to his own photograph, but this time he turned it over, revealing faded handwriting on the back. "We all signed it that last night before the mission. Added our hometowns, like we were kids at summer camp." He let out a soft, sad laugh. "Bobby wrote Heaven as his address, said that's where his music came from." Mitchell felt a deep ache in his chest as he watched the veteran trace the faded signatures with his finger. Each name represented not just a person, but an entire lifetime of possibilities that had been cut short. He thought about his father, about all the times he'd seen him sitting alone in their backyard, lost in thoughts he never shared. You know, the veteran continued, his voice growing stronger, we made that pact right here. Well, not right here. The bench was over there then, closer to the bookstore. Mrs. Chen had just closed up, but she saw us sitting out here. Brought us coffee and her homemade almond cookies. Said her father was a soldier too, in the old country. Said soldiers needed sweet things to balance out the bitter. A gust of wind swept through the shopping center, carrying a few fallen leaves across the empty parking lot. Mitchell adjusted his jacket around the veteran's shoulders, noticing how the man's hands had steadied as he spoke about that night. We thought we were being dramatic, making that pact, the veteran said, shaking his head slightly. Young men always think they're writing history. But we didn't understand then what it really meant. How important it would become. How this bench would be the one solid thing we could hold on to when everything else started slipping away. Mitchell looked at the vacant storefront where the bookstore had once stood, trying to imagine it as it had been. Warm lights in the windows, the smell of coffee and books, 5 young soldiers making a promise they didn't fully understand. The contrast between that moment and the present hit him hard, making him realize how many stories these empty spaces held, how many promises had been made and kept in places people passed by every day without noticing. The veteran carefully tucked the photograph back into his breast pocket, patting it gently as if reassuring himself it was safe. When he looked up at Mitchell again, his eyes were clearer, more present. Your father, he said softly, he'd be proud seeing you wear that badge. We all wanted to come home and make a difference. Some of us just had to find other ways to do it. The words hung in the cold night air, carrying a weight that went beyond their simple meaning. As Mitchell sat there, he realized that this night was becoming more than just another entry in his patrol log. It was becoming a bridge between generations, a reminder that behind every seemingly routine call, there might be a story waiting to be heard, a promise waiting to be honored. Officer Mitchell's decision to sit down beside the veteran changed everything about that cold night. What had started as a routine call was transforming into something much more meaningful, like watching a photograph slowly develop in front of his eyes. Mind if I ask your name, sir? Mitchell asked gently, noticing how the veteran's shoulders had relaxed slightly under his borrowed police jacket. Thomas, the veteran replied, his voice steadier now. Most folks just called me Tom. He paused, a faint smile touching his lips. Except my boys here, he patted the photograph in his pocket. They called me Pops, even though I was only 2 years older than most of them. A lone car passed through the parking lot, its headlights sweeping across them before disappearing around the corner. The brief illumination caught the gleam of tears in Tom's eyes, but these weren't the same desperate tears from earlier. Something had shifted in the atmosphere between them. You know what today is? Tom asked, not really expecting an answer. 48 years ago, we were preparing for what they called a routine patrol. Nothing routine about it, though. Nothing routine about any of it. His hand trembled slightly as he pulled the photograph out again, but this time he held it differently, like he was ready to share its story. This was taken 3 days before, he continued. Bobby, here with the guitar, he just finished writing a song for his little sister's birthday. Said he was going to perform it for her when he got home. Tom's finger moved to another face in the photo. And Pete, he had a letter from his wife in his pocket. She was expecting their first child. He carried that letter everywhere, read it so many times the paper was falling apart. Mitchell listened intently, understanding that each detail Tom shared was a piece of precious cargo he'd been carrying alone for far too long. The security guard's office light had gone dark, but neither man noticed. Time seemed to have created a bubble around their bench, where past and present merged in the telling of the story. We were supposed to check out a small area, just routine reconnaissance. Tom's voice grew quieter. The intelligence said it was clear, but intelligence reports, they don't always tell the whole story. He stopped, taking a deep breath. We walked into an ambush. The kind of firefight they don't show in movies. The kind that stays with you every single night of your life. Mitchell noticed how Tom's hands had steadied as he spoke, as if the act of sharing this burden was somehow making it lighter. The veteran pointed to each face in the photo, one by one, sharing small details that had survived decades of memory. How one loved strawberry ice cream, another collected bottle caps, another wrote poetry in a small notebook he kept in his boot. I was their squad leader, Tom said, his voice catching, responsible for bringing them home. That was my job, my duty. He looked up at the night sky, where a few stars managed to shine through the city's light pollution. When the shooting started, Bobby pushed me down. Took a bullet meant for me. His last words were about his sister's birthday song. Asked me to make sure she knew he'd finished it. The weight of responsibility, of survival, of promises kept and broken hung heavy in the air between them. Mitchell thought about his own father, about all the stories left untold, all the burdens carried in silence. After that day, Tom continued, the three of us who made it started this tradition. Meeting here every year, same date, same bench. Mrs. Chen from the bookstore, she'd leave a light on for us. Bring us coffee and those almond cookies. Said her father was a soldier too. Understood about remembering. He touched the breast buttons on his jacket, each one polished to a soft gleam. Last year, it was just me and Bill. We sat here till sunrise, talking about the old days, about the boys. Tom's voice grew softer. Bill passed away 3 months ago. Heart attack in his sleep. His daughter called to let me know. Said he was wearing his old uniform jacket when it happened. Mitchell felt a deep ache in his chest, understanding now why this night meant so much. So you came back, he said quietly, keeping the promise. Tom nodded, his eyes focused on something distant. Had to. They'd do the same for me. We swore that as long as one of us was breathing, we'd remember. Keep their stories alive. Make sure somebody knew they existed, knew who they were beyond just names on a wall. The veteran's hand went to his breast pocket again, where Mitchell now realized he must keep something besides the photograph. Tom slowly pulled out a tarnished harmonica. Bobby's, he explained. Found it in his gear afterward. Been carrying it ever since. Sometimes on nights like this, I swear I can still hear him playing. Mitchell watched as Tom turned the harmonica over in his hands, its surface worn smooth by decades of touch. This wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a bridge between worlds, between then and now, between those who returned and those who remained forever young in a faded photograph. The night had grown colder, but neither man moved. Sometimes, Mitchell realized, the most important part of police work had nothing to do with law enforcement. Sometimes it was about being present for moments like this, when the weight of history and memory needed a witness, needed someone to share its burden, if only for a little while. As the night deepened around them, Officer Mitchell began to understand that this wasn't just about a veteran keeping an old promise. There was something more immediate, more urgent in Tom's presence here tonight. The worn edges of his clothes, the tired look in his eyes, the way he held himself, all told a story that went beyond memories. Tom, Mitchell said carefully, you mentioned Mrs. Chen's bookstore being your usual meeting place. How long has it been closed? He'd noticed how the veteran kept glancing at the empty storefront, as if trying to see through time to when it was still filled with warm light and the smell of books. Tom's weather-worn hands tightened slightly on Bobby's harmonica. 6 months ago, he replied, his voice heavy with more than just the weight of the past. Everything changed after that. The whole neighborhood, really, used to be able to walk here from my apartment, just 3 blocks away. He paused, swallowing hard. The apartment building's gone now too. New owners decided to turn it into luxury condos. The pieces started falling into place in Mitchell's mind. The eviction, the lost community, the broken routine that had helped hold everything together for so many years. Sometimes the smallest changes could unravel an entire life, especially for someone carrying as much as Tom was. Been staying with my nephew for a while, Tom continued, though Mitchell noticed how his eyes wouldn't quite meet his as he spoke. But his wife's expecting twins. They need the spare room now. He tried to smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. It's fine. I understand. Life goes on, right? Mitchell thought about all the similar stories he'd encountered over his years on the force. Proud people, good people, who'd found themselves caught in circumstances they never expected. The cold night air seemed to grow heavier with each word Tom spoke. The hardest part wasn't losing the apartment, Tom said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. It was my routines. Every morning, I'd walk to the veterans' cemetery, spend time with the boys. He patted the breast pocket where the photograph resided. Talk to them about what's going on in the world. Clean their headstones. Make sure they knew they weren't forgotten. A light rain began to fall, soft droplets catching the glow of the street lamps. Mitchell shifted slightly, angling his body to better shield Tom from the weather. The veteran didn't seem to notice the rain, lost in his thoughts. "You know what scared me most in Vietnam?" Tom asked suddenly, looking up at Mitchell. "Not the fighting, not even the jungle. It was the thought of being forgotten. We all felt that way. Made each other promise that if something happened, we'd make sure somebody remembered." His voice cracked slightly. "Now I can't even visit them properly. The bus schedule changed, and my legs aren't what they used to be for walking that far." Mitchell felt something tighten in his chest. He thought about his own father, about all the veterans he'd encountered over the years. How many others were out there, carrying similar burdens, fighting battles that didn't end when they came home? "Last week," Tom continued, "I tried sleeping on a bench near the cemetery. Thought maybe I could still keep my morning routine. Security guard there was kind about it, but..." He shook his head. "Can't blame him. He was just doing his job, like your young friend over there." He nodded toward the shopping center's security office. The rain fell harder now, drumming a gentle rhythm on the metal awning above them. Tom's hands moved to the harmonica again, fingers tracing its worn surface. "Bobby used to play when it rained like this. Said the rain made everything sound better, more honest somehow." Mitchell watched as Tom's shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of everything, past and present, seeming to press down on him at once. But there was still pride there, still dignity in how he held himself. This wasn't a man looking for pity. This was a soldier trying to keep one last promise, trying to hold on to the things that anchored him to the world. "You know what's funny?" Tom said, managing a small but genuine smile. "All those years in the jungle, all those nights wondering if we'd make it home, and now here I am, sitting on a bench in the rain, talking to a police officer about it all." He looked at Mitchell directly. "Your father raised you right, son. Most would have just moved me along, done their job, and gone home. But you listened, just like Mrs. Chen used to do." The mention of his father hit Mitchell hard. How many stories had his dad carried alone? How many nights had he sat up, remembering faces from a photograph, wondering if anyone else would remember them too? As the rain continued to fall, Mitchell realized this night was becoming more than just a chance encounter between a cop and a veteran. It was becoming a bridge between generations, between past and present, between those who carried the weight of memory and those who were willing to help bear that burden, even if just for a little while. Officer Mitchell felt the weight of his phone in his pocket, remembering something that had completely slipped his mind until now. He'd worked closely with a local veterans support organization last summer during a community outreach program. The director there, an older veteran himself, had given Mitchell his personal number, saying, "Sometimes the hardest part is knowing who to call." The rain had settled into a gentle drizzle, creating a soft backdrop to their conversation. Tom sat quietly, his hands still cradling Bobby's old harmonica, seemingly lost in memories of rainy nights from long ago. "Tom," Mitchell said gently, "I might know some people who'd like to meet you." He chose his words carefully, understanding the pride that had kept this man silent about his struggles for so long. Fellow veterans who run an organization downtown. Good people who understand about keeping promises. Tom looked up, his expression cautious but interested. "What kind of organization?" "They help veterans stay connected," Mitchell explained, thinking about how to phrase this without making it sound like charity. They organize transportation to the veterans' cemetery, hold memorial services, help people find housing when they need it. Many of them served in Vietnam too. The mention of the cemetery caught Tom's attention. Mitchell could see it in the way he straightened slightly, in how his eyes focused more sharply on the present. "Would it be okay if I made a call?" Mitchell asked, pulling out his phone. "The director there, he's usually up late, says he got used to night watch in the service and never broke the habit." Tom nodded slowly, his hands still moving over the harmonica's surface. Mitchell stepped a few feet away, just far enough for privacy but close enough to keep an eye on Tom. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. As Mitchell explained the situation, keeping his voice low and respectful, he watched Tom from the corner of his eye. The veteran had taken out the photograph again, but something was different now. Instead of the desperate grit from earlier, he held it gently, almost hopefully, as if the simple act of sharing his story had somehow lightened its weight. The call lasted less than 5 minutes, but it set something important in motion. When Mitchell returned to the bench, he found Tom polishing the harmonica with the edge of his sleeve, as if preparing it to be seen by new eyes. "Good news," Mitchell said, settling back onto the bench. "My friend downtown, he'd like to meet you. Says they've got a van that makes daily trips to the cemetery, and," he paused, making sure to meet Tom's eyes, "they've got a veterans transitional housing program. Clean, private rooms, shared kitchen. A lot of the guys there served in Vietnam. They get together in the evenings, share stories, keep the memories alive." Tom's hands stilled on the harmonica. "I don't want to be a burden," he said quietly, but Mitchell could hear the hope fighting against the pride in his voice. "You wouldn't be," Mitchell assured him. "These guys, they understand about promises, about remembering. They've got a wall there with photographs, stories, memories of those who didn't make it home. They call it the Living Memorial." Something shifted in Tom's expression at those words. "A wall with photographs?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mitchell nodded. "They believe every story deserves to be heard, every promise kept. And they've got transportation, so you could still visit your friends at the cemetery every morning. Keep your routine." The security guard, who had been keeping a respectful distance, approached slowly with 2 cups of hot coffee from his office. He'd been watching, listening, learning something about judgment and compassion that no training manual could teach. "Thank you," stunned Tom said, accepting the coffee with slightly trembling hands. The young guard nodded, understanding now that his night had become part of something much larger than a simple trespassing call. "They're sending someone to pick us up in about 20 minutes, Mitchell explained, watching relief and anxiety battle across Tom's features. "Would you like to wait in my car where it's warmer? We can stop by your nephew's place to pick up your things if you'd like." Tom looked at the empty storefront one last time, then down at the photograph in his hand. "You think," he hesitated, "you think they'd let me put this up on their wall? Let me tell the boys stories?" Mitchell felt something warm spread through his chest, despite the cold night air. "I think that's exactly what they'd want," he said softly. "That's what these places are for, keeping promises, sharing memories, making sure no one gets forgotten." The veteran's eyes welled up, but these weren't the desperate tears from earlier in the night. These were different, tears of relief, of hope, of burdens shared rather than carried alone. "Bobby would have liked that," Tom said, carefully tucking the harmonica and photograph into his breast pocket. "He always said music and memories were meant to be shared." He stood slowly, his movements stiff from sitting in the cold, but his shoulders straighter than they'd been all night. "You know, officer, sometimes help comes from unexpected places." Mitchell smiled, thinking about how this night had started as a routine call and turned into something that would stay with him for the rest of his career. As they walked to his patrol car, he realized that sometimes being a police officer meant more than enforcing laws. Sometimes it meant being the bridge between past and present, between isolation and community, between despair and hope. The morning sun was just beginning to paint the sky in soft shades of pink and gold as Officer Mitchell pulled into the parking lot of the Veterans Support Center. The building was an old converted warehouse, but someone had taken the time to plant flowers along the walkway, their bright colors offering a warm welcome despite the early hour. Tom sat quietly in the passenger seat, his old military jacket now dry after their rainy night. His hands rested protectively over the breast pocket where Bobby's harmonica and the precious photograph were safely tucked away. The drive from his nephew's house had been quiet, but it was a comfortable kind of silence, the kind shared between people who had weathered something meaningful together. "Ready?" Mitchell asked softly, turning off the engine. He'd stayed well past the end of his shift, but some moments in life were worth the overtime. Tom nodded, his eyes taking in the building before them. A flag flew at half-mast out front, someone's memory being honored today. Near the entrance, Mitchell could see a group of older men setting up chairs in a circle, preparing for what he guessed was a morning gathering. As they approached, one of the men looked up and smiled. He walked toward them with the measured pace of someone who had learned that not all battles needed to be rushed. "You must be Tom," he said warmly, extending his hand. "I'm Richard. Served with the 25th Infantry. Welcome home, brother." Mitchell watched as something shifted in Tom's posture, a recognition, a remembering of the way soldiers greeted each other. His handshake was firm, dignified, carrying all the pride of his service years. The boys here, Richard continued, gesturing to the others setting up chairs. They're just getting ready for our morning coffee group. We start each day sharing stories, remembering those who aren't here to speak for themselves. He paused, noting the careful way Tom held his jacket closed. You're welcome to join us if you'd like. Tom's hand moved to his breast pocket, touching the outline of the photograph within. I have some stories that need telling, he said quietly. Richard's smile deepened with understanding. That's what we're here for, brother. Every story matters. Every memory deserves to be heard. Mitchell followed as Richard led them inside. The walls were lined with photographs, hundreds of them. Young faces in uniform smiled out from simple frames, each one accompanied by a small card telling their story. It wasn't just a wall of pictures. It was a living history, a promise kept. We call it the Wall of Honor, Richard explained, seeing Tom's eyes drawn to the photographs. Each one has a story, and we make sure those stories get told. Keep the memories alive for the next generation. Tom stopped in front of an empty space on the wall, just big enough for a new photograph. His hands trembled slightly as he reached into his pocket, carefully withdrawing the worn picture he'd carried for so many years. My boys, he said, his voice stronger now. They deserve to be remembered. Richard nodded, understanding everything that wasn't being said. We'll get this framed properly today, he promised. Would you like to tell us about them? We've got coffee brewing, and these old soldiers are always hungry for new stories. The circle of chairs was filling up now, other veterans drifting in with their own cups of coffee. They nodded in greeting, offering the silent acceptance that only those who'd shared similar experiences could give. Mitchell watched as Tom made his way to an empty chair, saw how naturally he fit into this circle of understanding. When he pulled out Bobby's harmonica, several of the men leaned forward with interest. My buddy Bobby's, Tom explained, his voice carrying clearly now. He used to play it in the rain. As the story began to unfold, Mitchell caught Richard's eye and nodded. It was time for him to go, to let Tom find his place among people who understood his journey in ways no one else could. Walking back to his patrol car, Mitchell could hear the low murmur of voices sharing stories, punctuated by occasional gentle laughter. He thought about how this night had started, a simple trespassing call that could have ended so differently. Over the next few weeks, Mitchell would stop by the center regularly, watching as Tom slowly rebuilt his life. The transitional housing program gave him more than just a roof, it gave him a community. Every morning, he'd join the van ride to the cemetery, keeping his promise to visit his fallen friends. Every evening, he'd share stories with his new brothers, keeping another promise, the promise that these men would not be forgotten. The empty bench outside the old bookstore remained, but it was no longer a place of lonely vigil. Instead, it became a reminder that sometimes the most important part of being a police officer wasn't enforcing laws, it was recognizing when someone needed more than just the letter of the law. It was understanding that behind every call, there might be a story waiting to be heard, a promise waiting to be kept, or a life waiting to be changed. As for Bobby's harmonica, it found a special place in a small display case beneath the photograph on the Wall of Honor. On quiet evenings, visitors to the center might hear soft, familiar tunes drifting through the halls. Tom playing the old songs, keeping the music alive, making sure that Bobby's spirit, like all their memories, lived on in the stories they shared.